and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're learning about the 2009 biopic of Amelia Earhart's life, simply called Amelia. So let's hop right into our movie synopsis. At the beginning of the movie, we're introduced to Hilary Swank's version of Amelia Earhart and a publisher named George Putnam. He's played by Richard Gere. And it's Putnam who picks Amelia to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Although she's not the pilot, she's a passenger on that flight. But it's still a historic flight, and thanks to Putnam's savvy PR skills, this new aviation record makes Amelia an instant celebrity, which George then uses to help fund her future endeavors through things like endorsements and lectures. We also see Amelia and George's professional relationship evolve into a romantic one, eventually leading to marriage, as well as hints of a possible affair with Ewan McGregor's version of Jean Vidal. Meanwhile, Amelia goes from being the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger to becoming the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic when she does that in 1932, despite perilous conditions along the way. Throughout the movie and culminating at the end, we see Amelia's attempt to fly around the world with navigator Fred Noonan. Noonan is played by Christopher Eccleston in the movie. But things don't go well, as there are communication failures with the U.S. Coast Guard ship, and most of the ship's attempts to contact Amelia don't seem to be heard. Until silence. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan's plane simply disappears without a trace. She was only 39 years old, while he was 44 at the time of their disappearance on July 2nd, 1937. What do we know about the true story? What's the current status of the search for her plane? And most importantly, who was the real Amelia Earhart? To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, I'm excited to be joined by author, documentarian, and host of the Chasing Earhart podcast, Chris Williamson. Chris has spent years digging into Amelia Earhart's life and, of course, her disappearance. So he is the perfect person to help us unravel the true story behind the movie. You'll find links to Chris's work in the show notes for this episode. But before we bring Chris on the line, there's one more thing we need to do. Set up our game. If you're new to the show, since Based on a True Story is all about separating fact from fiction in the movies, you'll get to practice your skills at separating fact from fiction in this podcast episode with a game of Two Truths and a Lie. So I'm going to give you three things we're going to talk about throughout this episode. Two of those things are true. And that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Amelia Earhart's final communication came just after they took off from Howland Island. Number two, Amelia's celebrity served as a powerful means for her to champion other women in STEM and aviation. Number three, Amelia was a nurse's aide during World War I. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, see if you can figure out which one of those is a lie. And if you're watching the video version of this, you can see I'm holding up an envelope, and this has the answer inside. So we're going to open this up at the end of the episode and see if you got the right one. All right, now it's time to connect with Chris Williamson about the historical accuracy of 2009's Amelia. Before we dig into some of the key plot points from 2009's Amelia, let's take a step back and look at the movie from an overall perspective and how it captures Amelia Earhart's story. If you were to give it a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
Start off with the hard questions, Dan. That's a tough one. Maybe a C+, B- if I'm feeling really generous. It really depends on the day. The film covers the basics. It covers her Atlantic flight, covers her marriage to Putnam, the Electra, her disappearance. Well, doesn't really cover the disappearance, but it kind of like preludes it. Kind of a precursor for the disappearance and kind of ends on that, which is kind of, haunting. It kind of simplifies who Earhart was. Earhart was a very complex person. She's a very complex woman. She had a lot of different, sides to her. And some of the events are sort of, according to me, sort of a little bit overly tweaked and overly analyzed, and maybe kind of a little bit of movie magic is kind of thrown in there. And they've taken some liberties, which you can't really, it is a historical piece, but you can't really, there's so much of a mystery to this. It's hard to not take some kind of historical liberty a little bit here and there, especially when it comes to some of the characters that came in and out of her life, specifically toward the end, like Fred Noonan and stuff, which I'm sure we'll get into as we get further in the conversation. But yeah, a C+, maybe a B-.
Okay, yeah, that's not, and like you said, I mean, again, it is movie and entertainment, but every movie makes different changes in the creative decisions that they do to tell a historical story. So I'm always curious, just kind of get that overall general sense, where's the ballpark here on this?
Yeah, they did a good job with it, overall. I mean, it wasn't, again, historical accuracy is picked apart, I think, in every film. I think it's very rare that a film gets it like, spot on or pretty close to spot on. This one, obviously, Amelia's life was, one of our guests, Lori, who just has a book out currently, said, Amelia's first few years of her career was like the first reality show. She was like cast in this part, which we'll of course get into probably in the next few questions. But yeah, it's when you have stuff like that, it takes a lot of creative liberty to sort of tell the story, especially when you have limited sources and limited time, and a movie studio that I'm sure wants to put certain things into the film and all that. So
you mentioned what my next question is going to be, because at the very beginning of the movie, we learned that a man named George Putnam, he published Charles Lindbergh's book in 1927. And then George gets financing from a socialite named Amy Guest to find a woman to be the first to fly across the Atlantic. And there's a contract here that we learn about in the movie to tell this woman's story in the New York Times and also to write a book about it. But all that money is going to go back to Mrs. Guest as the financier. And then George finds Amelia Earhart, and that's how she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic in 1928. Although the movie shows Amelia being a passenger. The pilot is a man named Bill Stoltz, and navigator is Slim Gordon. But according to George in the movie, the pilot signed a deal to say that Amelia is the commander. So it kind of makes it sound like she was the one in charge. Although when we're riding along in the movie, it also shows that Amelia is pretty much just along for the ride. How well does the movie do set up Amelia Earhart's trip across the Atlantic in 1928?
Yeah, it gets a lot of the basic foundational stuff right. I mean, Putnam was involved with Lindbergh's book prior. He had made a name for himself prior to Earhart walking into his office. Amy Guest is a really interesting woman. Amy Guest, think about the time, this is 27, 28. This woman was a billionaire with a B. So at that time, she really wanted to go on the flight herself. The whole vehicle was initially meant to be for her. Amy Phipps Guest wanted to be the first woman across the Atlantic. And her family, her kids specifically said, hell no, you're not going to be the first woman across the Atlantic because so many people have already died, women included, trying to attempt this. And so credit to Amy Guest, who didn't poo-poo who saw the bigger picture and didn't poo-poo the flight just because she wasn't going to be the star of the show. She, asked George Putnam and to come up with, the right American pilot or the right woman, to do this. And Earhart at the time was in 28. You have to understand, she wasn't, her flights and she was flying for the fun of it, but she was flying a lot of that time to promote the Denison House and the social work that she was doing in Boston. And she wasn't really, not that she wasn't looking for her next big step, but when it came, it was kind of out of left field. And, there's a lot of infamous interactions between, her first interaction with George Putnam wasn't very positive. She thought he was a pompous, I can't know if I can cuss on the show, but she thought he was a pompous asshole, and she really didn't feel like he was, a very good guy. Calling her the commander, yeah, it definitely was a PR move. They wanted Earhart, though, to feel like she had some power in the flight. And she did exercise that power. She had a lifelong issue with alcoholism and drinking, and she despised really people that did. And, went all the way back to her father when she was a little girl. It will appear again with Fred Noonan as we get further into this conversation. And it appeared here in the 28 friendship flight. And, they were drunk. These guys were drunk. And she was just, she was beside herself. And she really took it seriously because to her, this wasn't just another flight. To her, this was her chance at making history. And these guys were kind of sort of, not taking it as seriously as she would have liked it. But yeah, that's all fairly accurate. I mean, Putnam, comes her husband later. He plays a big role in her public image. Obviously, we'll talk about that a lot today. But calling her the commander wasn't about deception necessarily, but it definitely was a PR move to help sort of launch her into the stratosphere, which, he was right.
I think we do see a little clip of that in the movie. There's a scene I remember even before they took off. One of the guys was drinking and Amelia comes in and basically tells him off. She clearly doesn't like that he's drinking and he's, and when I was watching that, I guess I think she mentioned something about her father, but the impression that I got was also like, you're going to be flying this plane and my life is on the line here. And, do your job, basically.
Yeah, I don't want to die. Yeah, I don't want to be
yeah.
another statistic. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she was very serious about it. She had dreamed about this moment, but she had kind of put it away, and then it kind of came roaring back into her life in a very earth-shattering way, and in the form of the 28 flight. So yeah, it changed everything for her, and she took it very seriously. She was not happy with them drinking on that flight.
You mentioned earlier kind of being cast, and in the movie, George basically tells Amelia that he picked her to be the pilot, not because of her skills, because, as the movie puts it, pretty girls command more attention. So was it true that Amelia was recruited for basically her looks over experience, like the movie suggests?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at first, she definitely was, they wanted an American girl, like I said earlier in the chat. I mean, it was a reality casting. It was an early days of reality casting. That's really what it was. They were looking for somebody that would fit the bill, that would look the part. The whole Lady Lindy thing was a real thing. He wanted to basically copy Charles Lindbergh, and just make a female version of Charles Lindbergh. And, he was definitely successful at that. The man, was brilliant when it came to PR and kind of, what he was doing. He knew exactly where he wanted to go with Amelia. And I think, he sort of had that tunnel vision that a lot of people maybe didn't around him, other than maybe Amelia herself. Once they got together, that was like a whole nother thing. It kind of supercharged her career. So, but yeah, I would say it's largely right. I mean, looks played a role in it. She looked like, she was a pretty woman. She had all these jobs. She had all these ties into the backbone of America. Like, it just made a lot of sense in a lot of different ways. But I'd be lying if I said looks wasn't a big part of it, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that leads right into my next question, because in the movie, after the successful trip across the Atlantic, when Amelia returns to the U.S., she instantly becomes a celebrity. And in addition to the book deal, now we start to find out that George seems to have turned the trip into other money-making opportunities. He mentions the Lucky Strike cigarettes that he kind of snuck in there. And not to get too far ahead of where we are in the movie's timeline, but about halfway through the movie, we also see Amelia doing things like commercials for her own brand of luggage and clothing. And we see then George talking about how he convinced Purdue University to pay $80,000 for the electric plane that Amelia flew around the world, that, of course, we'll talk about later in our discussion. But the impression that I got then was, as I was watching the movie here, was basically Amy Guest financed the first flight, but then after that, it was kind of George Putnam who basically secured sponsors to finance both himself and Amelia's career. Is that really how Amelia Earhart earned money for her flying career?
Yeah, it's pretty spot on. Earhart, worked a lot of jobs. Worked a lot of jobs before she became famous, and that didn't change when she became famous. Just the job type changed. That's all it was. He was obviously the best of the best at publicity. He wasted no time. He got her into, as you mentioned, speaking gigs, endorsement deals, magazine features. The Lucky Strike ad that you mentioned, she wasn't happy with that. She kind of later regretted that, tying her face and her likeness and her name to cigarettes. But that was all sort of part of like this large branding effort. I mean, they wanted to explode her into the stratosphere. They wanted to make her paste her face everywhere. It's really not unlike what they do with celebrities today. When you see certain names and they're everywhere all of a sudden, they're advertising for everybody. It's I compare it kind of very different, but I compare it to when Patrick Mahomes, we're out in Kansas City here, when he became really big. I mean, he's advertising everything out here in Kansas City. It's everything. Banks and Whataburger and like just all kinds of things, you name it. So it's not very different. I think George Putnam just kind of was doing it in the 20s, and doing it in the 30s, up until Amelia disappeared. But she wasn't just along for the ride. I mean, I think we've talked about this a lot on the show. She helped shape her own image. She was a very, strong woman. She had a lot of goals. She had no problem, doing what she needed to do to achieve those goals. She had her own luggage set, her own clothing line. She was a editor for Cosmopolitan. I mean, this woman was everywhere. And the Purdue connection, to just kind of wrap it up, it's legit. She was brought in by the then president Purdue. I'm forgetting Edward C. Elliott. I forgot his name for a second. He saw her. She had already been speaking on the lecture circuit, and he saw her, and he was like, "Holy shit, this woman is like amazing. This woman is amazing. She's garnering, all of this following, and all these people are just mesmerized by her." And I think to Elliott's credit, he saw that and brought her into to Purdue and helped her fund her, her Electra. They even called it the Flying Laboratory. She was given a special designation, a career counselor for women, if I'm not mistaken, or something along the lines of that. This is a woman who was in classrooms in Purdue in the 20s, 100 years ahead of her time, talking about things like STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, trying to get a lot of women and men, really, for that matter, but women specifically, to say, look, you don't have to get a general degree and go back into the home. And well, now you got to go get married. No, you can fly. You can be, you can begin mathematics. You can be an engineer. You can be a mechanic, things like that. So a lot of that is very, the groundwork that the movie lays is very good, is very solid. And it hits a lot of the big strides,
I can understand in the movie, just not getting into that side of it, there would be a lot of time to get into her promoting that kind of stuff. But it's fascinating that you're talking about, reality show ahead of the time, but it sounds like she was really ahead of her time too. Like in what she was promoting there with women in STEM and stuff like that. I can't imagine that was very popular back in the 1920s.
Yeah. And it was very important to her. Very important to her. She was a champion of women. She was a champion of aviation. She wanted to be on the front line. She saw no problem with really the fame. She was sort of a walking double-edged sword. I mean, she loved her privacy. I think there was a man that she dated, to take it back a little bit, and I know we're jumping around, but to take it backwards a little bit, before she met George, there was a man, and I'm remiss if I didn't say this, that she was engaged to. His name was Sam Chapman. And Sam Chapman was, in my opinion, was really the love of her life. And he was, if you look him up, he was fiercely private. He protected that privacy. There were moments in the middle of Earhart's career, early in her career, where they were still together. This is before she, got engaged and started having an affair with George and married George, where they would spend time together. They would drive up the coast after she got back from a flight, and they'd spend 3 or 4 hours together before she had to be rushed back to her schedule, the rest of her stuff. But she was very much in love with Sam, to the point that if she had trusted him specifically with, what to do with everything after she died, if she didn't make it across, the transatlantic flight or her solo. I mean, she really loved him, really trusted him. So Sam was, I think, the love of her life, but George Putnam was just a natural fit. And it just kind of worked out for Amelia when it comes to the publicity side of things, that she happened to be with, have somebody in her pocket that was probably the best she could have at the time.
Well, I wonder if some of that leads into my next question, because if we go back to the movie, we see George and Amelia, their relationship transitions from a strictly professional one to a romantic one as well. And he's the one that seems to be more entirely smitten with her and wants to get married. And even though she does seem to eventually love him, she doesn't want to commit to a marriage. And maybe some of what you were just talking about kind of alludes into that. But then skipping ahead in the timeline of the movie a little bit, later on, George eventually does convince her to marry him. Do you think the movie does a good job telling the true story of George and Amelia's relationship?
It gets the broad strokes right. It's such a deep relationship. There's a book, I will promote it. It's not mine. You've probably heard of it. It's called The Aviator and the Showman. It's by Lori Gwen Shapiro. It just dropped. We just had Lori, was the most current episode of our show. And, that relationship, if you really want to know the gritty, nitty gritty details, read that book, because there's so much more to that relationship. And Lori did a fantastic job of uncovering some new information that hadn't been previously known historically. But it does get the broad strokes, for the most part, fairly accurate. He was very persistent. He pushed. I mean, I can appreciate that. As soon as I saw my wife, I told my friend, like, that's my wife. She doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to marry her. And it took me a little while, but I was very persistent. So I can admire that persistence in Mr. Putnam. But she was obviously much more hesitant. She valued her independence really above anything else, her flying, her public life, all her private relationships and things of that nature. And she wrote a really famous letter to George, and I'm paraphrasing, but she talks about her reluctance to marry him, and that marrying him sort of shatters any chances in her work, which really meant more than anything, getting women in aviation out there. And really the mission, the cause, was the most important thing to her, more than anything else. And, she tells him famously in that letter, you got to let me go in a year. If we don't find happiness, even though it's an attractive cage, I can't stay in a cage. And you got to promise you'll let me go in a year. I won't hold you to any medieval, marital obligations, and you don't hold me to any marital obligations either. And she was, again, what, 100 years? I mean, this is way off topic, but if you look at like the status of like marriage now, just how much open marriage is there, how much that, this is in the jazz age 100 years ago almost. And, open marriage, it's weird how it comes around in circles. Like that was a very common thing at that time. And it just wasn't really talked about. But the people that were really well known, that were sort of in those circles, like Amelia Earhart and George Putnam, once those things started to get out, people were like, well, of course, it was, because it was the jazz age, and everybody was having affairs, and everybody was sleeping around, and everybody was, had this sort of looseless kind of look at marriage and long-term relationships. So, people could argue that she was way ahead of her time, or people could say that, well, just everybody was doing that at the time. That was just kind of the way of the world.
Since we are on the topic of Amelia's personal relationships, another one we see in the movie is Jean Vidal, who also works with Amelia for a little bit while. And we don't really see them sleeping together in the movie, although there is a scene where we see Jean and Amelia kissing in an elevator. So the impression that I got was that Amelia probably had an affair with Jean while she was married to George. Was there a romantic relationship between Amelia and Jean?
Maybe. We don't have any. So I will tell you this: there's no definitive proof. So okay. The film does take liberty there with the elevator kiss, which I'd forgotten about. I just remember that as you told me. It's like, oh yeah, she did. Yeah, she did sneak a kiss in the elevator. There's no definitive proof that they ever had a relationship. They were friends. They were close, as she was with a lot of people. Jean was obviously, he was the father of Gore Vidal, who was a writer, and Gore is really the one that sort of kept this rumor alive, for lack of a better phrase. But Gore was a fantasy writer, and he was a kid, when he would have seen Amelia with Jean. And, doesn't mean that if we're, 6, 7 years old, we don't remember things that we see, definitively. But, you sort of take that into consideration, that in combination with there never being any physical or any kind of proof or any letters between the two of them that would say, hey, we were romantic together or anything like that. There's just no, to use a term from The Disappearance, there's no smoking gun for that. So, it's rumor and innuendo to which there is an awful lot when it comes to Amelia Earhart, both pre-death and certainly post-death. So
it sounds like maybe the movie, and movies do this a lot. You have this one little fact you're talking about, open relationships being a bigger thing, and then this other element of it, and they're like, okay, we're just going to connect these dots and just kind of fill in some of those gaps, even if there's not a dot in the middle of proof that we know. But it's a movie, and we have that creative license to do that. It sounds like that's kind of what they're doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of what Hollywood does with a lot of it. So yeah.
Well, speaking of Amelia Earhart's supporting other women, one of the other women aviators in the movie that we see is Eleanor Smith. And the movie shows Amelia being very supportive of Miss Smith and really any other women flyers that she comes across. But when Amelia isn't around, George tries to convince Eleanor to purposely let Amelia win a derby flight from Santa Monica to Cleveland to, as the movie puts it, benefit women flyers everywhere. And of course, the sponsorships that the movie shows, I'm sure would also benefit him financially too. But then we see Amelia coming in third behind Louise Hayden and Gladys O'Donnell. Anyway, so the movie is really unclear if George's influence had any effect on that outcome. Does the movie accurately portray the different perspectives that Amelia Earhart and George Putnam had on other women flyers like Eleanor Smith?
Yeah, it does. So I will tell you, it does portray it accurately. Amelia, you're right, 100%. Amelia was very friendly with all of her compatriots, the people that, fellow 99s, people that she was flying with, people in the air derby races, other female aviators. She was very sweet. And I think if you look at any of the documentation that's out there, you're going to be hard pressed to find an instance where Amelia ever like cussed another female aviator out or anything like that, or showed more than minor frustrations, of things. But it wasn't with anybody in particular. Eleanor Smith was a absolute animal when it came to, she was one of the best flyers ever. She was a fantastic aviator, and she was technically a much more skilled pilot, admitted by Amelia herself. Amelia has said several times on record that, she's not the most talented pilot. If you talk to a lot of aviation historians, they'll tell you about people like Poncho Barnes. They'll tell you about Florence Klingensmith. They'll tell you about Ruth Elder, Ruth Nichols, Eleanor Smith. I mean, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of women that were incredible flyers. George, while that particular event with the air derby race with Eleanor Smith, that particular event was fictionalized. It was more of a representation of kind of what he would do. So, yes, he did try to influence negatively and pressure a lot of the other women and try to tell them things like, they wouldn't have a career if, they didn't allow Earhart to do ... or whatever. Now, Earhart and Putnam were sort of at odds with that, but Earhart obviously didn't know a lot of that stuff. I think that, there were instances where Earhart found out that George Putnam was pressuring people, and she would go talk to George and tell him, like, look, this is important. You can't be talking to women like this. You can't be, talking to my compatriots like this. So yeah, I mean, that particular moment, no. But did that stuff happen all the time? Absolutely. I mean, George was fiercely competitive and wanted Earhart to be the woman, the face of aviation. And, to his credit, we're still sitting here talking about her. And so he must have done something right.
I guess sometimes, yeah, when you're in PR like that, you got to kind of do what you got to do. And he's doing his job. But then Amelia being, married to her job, it sounds like you're going to butt heads and be at odds sometimes, it seems.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it's he was brutal, but I don't think George had a problem being the bad guy, when it came to that. If it resolved the mission and if it got them to where they needed to be, I don't think he had a problem with that. He just wasn't the kind of guy that had a problem with that. It was just business. It wasn't personal.
Well, if we go back to the movie, after being the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger, the movie then shows Amelia wanting to become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, and that happens in 1932. We see her leaving New Jersey with a plan to arrive in Paris, but then there's some issues with a storm and icing along the way, and the movie shows her landing successfully in Gallagher's pasture, which just seems to be a random farm in Ireland as she's greeted by a shepherd and his sheep. But still, it's a successful flight across the Atlantic and makes history for the first nonstop solo flight for a woman. And the movie mentions the second person following Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight. How well does the movie do showing Amelia Earhart's historic flight across the Atlantic in 1932?
Yeah, it's pretty accurate for the most part, as far as everything you laid out, where she landed, where she started from. The inclement weather, to say the least. I mean, she was in an open weathered cockpit. So, I mean, in that
Wow.
Vega. So, I mean, you weren't in an Electra like she was, in 37, where she had some cover. So she was just getting dumped on with everything that, the good Lord was throwing at her while she was going across the Atlantic. And, so this is the flight that, if the Friendship flight made her a world star, this shot her into the stratosphere. It earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross. She was obviously, as you mentioned, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic right after Lindbergh. But the historical accuracy of sort of like what she dealt with and kind of how she handled the flight and the things that she sort of encountered was largely accurate. And yeah, she did. The weather was so bad it did blow her way off course, and she did end up in Ireland in a cow pasture. And it's it's one of those really famous stories that sort of makes her America's sweetheart. Gives her that status of America's sweetheart. She arrives in Ireland, and the guy's like, have you come far? And she's like, from America. She knew she knew what she was doing. She knew she had made it. I can't imagine whether you land in the right spot or not, just to touch ground after what she went through. I got to imagine she made it technically, even though she didn't end up in the same spot that she planned out to be. She did, make it across the Atlantic. And I can't imagine the weight off her shoulders and really the vindication, right, that she probably must have felt internally at that time. Maybe we'll never know, because she never really talked about herself in a really like a pompous way or anything. If she talked any kind of pompousness at all, it was just about women in general, women in aviation, and women can do the things that men could do, and all that jazz. But yeah, I mean, it largely gets it right. I mean, for the most part, again, broad strokes, but pretty accurate for what she had to endure.
Yeah, I could imagine what that would be like, especially because that first flight, she was mostly, I mean, a passenger. You mentioned, she did have some control there too, but she wasn't the pilot, which is what she wanted to do. And then I can imagine with people like Eleanor Smith, who was actually a great pilot. And I could imagine just internally, you're starting to feel like, can I actually do this? Like, is this something I could actually do? And starting to have some of those doubts. So I just imagine, yeah, there has to be a huge weight off. Like, yeah, I can do this. Yeah.
You can do it. And in that Vega, which is a gorgeous plane, it's in the Smithsonian. I've stood underneath it. It's such a beautiful plane. A very strong plane for its time, but by today's standards, it's, very basic, very unforgiving, very loud. Imagine navigating a flight like that with, no GPS, no modern instruments, near freezing temperatures, rain dumped on your face, and then doing it alone, right? I mean, doing it alone. You have nobody you can really talk to. You have no one to lean on. It's just you and that ocean. And it must have been horrifying, but she was, she loved it. It's all she ever wanted to. From the first moment she saw it and it clicked for her, it was what she wanted. And I think she just didn't see, she saw the fear, but I don't know. I can't really explain her fearlessness. It was kind of different, which makes her very final moments historically recorded that much more haunting, which we'll get to toward the end. Yeah.
Yeah, that I love that you mentioned, no GPS, as you were saying. I was like, I got to use GPS to get to the grocery store, right? I mean, these days we just rely on it, right? It's just so you just common, you just doesn't matter. You just get used to that and just follow that line. Or when you're falling asleep while you're driving, I'm gonna roll the window down a little bit and be a little cool. But that's a whole other level of just an open cockpit and at altitude. And I can't.
How loud? How loud it must have been the whole time. And all of that, just all that together would have been very difficult to overcome at that time.
Well, in the movie, there are a few achievements that are really just mentioned only briefly. There's a headline that says Amelia took an autogyro up 19,000 feet to set a new altitude record. There's another one that mentions her being the first to achieve a solo flight from Hawaii to California. These are all just kind of headlines that we see pass by very quickly in the movie. But can you fill in some more historical details around some of the aviation records that Amelia Earhart set in the movie that it doesn't really show us?
Yeah, I can flesh it out a little bit. The autogyro was one of my favorite stories. It was sort of like this, it was sort of like a helicopter. It was like a prototype helicopter kind of aircraft. She took it up 19,000, well, not quite 19, but I say a little over 18,000 feet, but pretty close to 19,000 feet. Promptly crashed it. Came down after the crash, was fine, and was like, yeah, your autogyro needs some improvements. But she set a record in it. So, she did that, obviously, for big one, first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 32. We talked about that. It was the Distinguished Flying Cross was a big deal. Cross of the Knight of the Legion of Honor from France, I want to say. And she received a lot of awards for that, a lot of accolades. First person, as you mentioned, to fly from Hawaii to California, a much, much funner flight than going across the Atlantic. But, it's still very dangerous. 2,500 miles of ocean, if I'm not mistaken. And not even Lindbergh had done it, so like she had done what Lindbergh had done. And she's like, all right, now I'm going to take this 5 steps forward now. And I'm just going to make the history books not forget about Charles Lindbergh, but I'm going to dwarf Charles Lindbergh. I felt that she really wanted to do that because she wanted to do it for women. It was I think that was the first, it was the first flight from the mainland US to Hawaii, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, man or woman, but I think it was the first flight. She flew across in 32. She also flew across the US, the United States, the continental United States, Los Angeles to New Jersey, which is interesting when you look at the disappearance stuff and some of the theories. And speed records, lots of speed records and other distance records. She won some races. She really boned up her navigation skills over time in those couple of years, from 28 to like 32, 33, 34, 35. Really tried to get better. She flew from Mexico City to New Jersey, I believe, as well, and Los Angeles to Mexico City. So a bunch of little flights, not little flights, but a bunch of smaller flights. But she was just racking up records and racking up altitude records and speed records and all these things all along the way, and just becoming a better a pilot. And then she sort of shifted into becoming sort of this bigger than just a pilot face for women in aviation and for women in general, not just in aviation, but aviation was sort of the launching pad, but for women to do things in general that she felt they should be already doing.
I'm curious how much of that was pressure from George as PR, because you think of, with PR, it's easier to sell a new record, a new something, and how much of that was her wanting to push beyond Lindbergh and promote women in aviation, and how much of that was George be like, oh, we got to top what we did last time, make a new record, do this.
Yeah, both. Sure, she had her own reasons certainly for doing it. Don't get me wrong, she loved the fame, but I think she loved the fame for different reasons. I really think she saw the fame as a catalyst to get what she ultimately wanted, which was women into the forefront of, what would become modern day aviation at the time. So, George certainly pushed for more records, more flights, it bumped up her lecture costs. It bumped up her, more books. It bumped up, more appearances. She was everywhere, christening cars. I mean, doing all the blimps. She'd come out, she'd make an appearance somewhere, like a planned appearance, and there would be 10,000 people there to see her. I mean, insane for this is in the 20s and the 30s. So this is you think this would be someone that was modern, but this was like a Taylor Swift before Taylor Swift. This was like a pick any real famous female celebrity now, any famous celebrity really, and it's really she is that before them, which is really kind of interesting. She kind of set the groundwork for it. And then, I think that kind of rolls into her role with Purdue, to kind of take it back to Purdue. I mean, that was when she really started speaking a lot more on the lecture circuit. That's when Edward C. Elliot comes along, sees her speaking, brings her into Purdue. She's the first woman to receive a National Aeronautic Association license. She's one of the, not the, but one of the very first female instructors in aviation. Her role at Purdue really amplifies that. And not to mention, she's the president and the co-founder of the 99s, which is still going right now. So, I mean, it's, not bad for someone whose career, but when you think about this, when she met George Putnam was 1928, she was gone in 37. So not even 10 years later, she was gone. And what's really interesting about Earhart, and I'll touch more on this at the end, is, we never really got to see her age. We never got to see her become like this old, feeble woman. We didn't see her die as an old lady in a bed. We just kind of saw her fly off into the sunset, and we don't have a period on the end of that sentence, which is what makes films like 2009's Amelia, with the one we're talking about today, and and Flight for Freedom, and all those other films that have been made over the years that have tied to Earhart in one way or another. It makes them very significant. And Amelia is one of those films I think that probably did it best, so far out of all the films, but there's always room for improvement, of course.
What were her lectures like? Was she teaching more like teaching how to be a pilot? Because also we learned earlier, like her experience as a pilot she admitted was not as great as some others, or was she more just kind of recounting her adventures? I call them adventures, but terrifying adventures in some of them. But these flights, was it more just kind of here's what I've done, or is it more teaching?
I think it was a little bit of both. She talked on the lecture circuit for sure. She was talking about her adventures. Great word. I mean, that's exactly what she would probably have used. But when it came to being in the classroom, I mean, this is a woman who, gritty, was in the classroom, spent time, she ate at Purdue, she lived, she stayed at Purdue. I mean, she was there, she was all in. And in the classrooms, I think it was more of a, talking to women, motivating women, being in the classroom, being one-on-one with female students, male students. She had also gotten Purdue to build a mechanics lab, an aviation mechanics lab that was going to be there, that was going to sort of take the spotlight when she returned from the world flight. And it was just a lab that, anybody, male or female, could go in there and tinker with engines and could, look at the ins and outs of the mechanics of how airplanes worked. And not just airplanes, but just, other things. They called her the flying laboratory, because she was going to take, air samples, water samples, land samples from all around the world and bring those back to Purdue, so they can sort of study maybe parts of the world that hadn't really been heavily traveled yet, or at least by modern people. And that again ties into some of the theory and some of the disappearance ideas and stuff. But she was lecturing, broad spectrum, broad strokes, talking about her adventures, and then in the classroom, it allowed her to get into the more nitty gritty and get one-on-one with people, and she did both very well to a very high degree.
That ties right into what you're talking about, her wanting to push women in STEM. I mean, lead by example, right? It seems like that's exactly what she was doing.
Absolutely. She was the definition of they say a real leader is going to be there with you. They're not going to be shouting instructions. They're going to be doing it. And she was doing it. I mean, she wasn't, this is a woman who had, God, I couldn't even tell you how many different jobs that she had to support her flying. Now, again, there has been some new information that's come out that would maybe make you look at things a little bit differently. But I would say that wasn't in the movie. For instance, it's part of Laurie's book. It's kind of a big spoiler, but the book's out now, so people can read it for themselves. But one of Laurie's big revelations in the book is that Amelia Earhart had, and this is her word, not mine, had a sugar daddy. Had a much wealthier older guy who actually bought her cars and bought her some of her planes, not her Electra, of course, but early in her career. So the whole idea of her having all these jobs and everything, that certainly did happen. But she was a woman, and she knew how to use her her feminine wiles, to use a term I hate. But I just don't have anything else to say to kind of come up with that's better. I would say that she knew how to sort of flip that switch. I compare her a lot to a Marilyn Monroe type figure, where if you look at Marilyn's history, Marilyn, and in the films and books and all that stuff, Marilyn could turn it on like a switch. She was a very kind of a quiet, private person, but when she was in front of the media, it's like, okay, got to turn it on, got to go to work. And that's kind of what Earhart did. But she had, she used everything in her power that she had to be able to acquire, again, mission first, more than anything else. She had a dream, and she wanted to achieve it. And damn, whatever she had to do it.
Well, we've talked a lot about the events, but something we haven't really talked about much. We've a little bit here, but obviously everybody, well, spoiler alert, we know what's going to happen. But throughout the movie, interspersed, we see Amelia's flight around the world with Fred Noonan. And it's not really till the end of the movie that it starts to focus on that flight. So there's a lot we can talk about with that. But according to the way it's set up in the movie, it starts in Miami, June 1st, 1937. And that's when Amelia meets Fred for what looks like in the movie the first time. The movie suggests that he was hired for the flight because he's the best celestial navigator of that time. And for Amelia's flight around the world to be successful, there's one part that she'll really need his help with, and that's finding this tiny island called Howland Island, which is positioned roughly halfway between Papua New Guinea and Hawaii. The problem, according to the movie, is that Howland Island is less than 2 miles long, no taller than 18 feet, making it next to impossible to see in the expanse of the ocean. But that's why it's important to find, because according to the movie, again, refueling midair is something beyond Amelia's skill level, so they'd have to land to refuel and then finish the journey. Does the movie correctly set up the reasons why Fred Noonan joined Amelia Earhart as her navigator for the flight around the world?
Yeah, it doesn't go into a lot. It touches on certain aspects of Noonan's character and who he was. You put it perfectly. I couldn't put it better myself. I say this all the time in media. If you were going to do a flight of that magnitude, that would be the guy that you would want to have on board the flight with you. No question. If you look at his history, he was a big reason why Pan Am was able to map so much of the Pacific that they were able to map, and the Atlantic as well. He was a skilled celestial navigator, and he was the best in the world, and she believed in him. And it was important for Noonan. This is a guy who was newly remarried at the time of the flight, and he had dreams of his own. I think he ultimately wanted to set up a navigation school post world flight. I think not only Amelia, but Fred, and of course, and George Putnam, they were all looking at this flight as a way to basically set their life for the back half of their careers. And so, it largely gets, Noonan accurate. He did have a drinking problem. We talk about this all the time on the show. We've debated it heavily on Vanish. A lot of experts now will tell you that a drunk Noonan was probably better than 90% of sober navigators at the time. and that Noonan was sort of a functional alcoholic. So he could drink, he can get kind of plastered the night before, and he could show up for work and do his job, to a very high ability the next day. Now, Earhart didn't like that he drank, clearly. It takes us back to the friendship flight, takes us back to her, her days with her father when, they want to play cowboys and Indians, and he would stumble in the house drunk, obviously, and they wouldn't be able to, play with him, and he'd have to go pass out. And, so she really, I mean, the alcoholism ran really deep with her when it came to, men and alcoholism. So, Noonan was a very excellent navigator, but he had some demons. He had some issues. He respected Earhart. Earhart respected him. I think they respected each other's professional abilities. And there's even a quote somewhere in Oakland, I think, early, or maybe even it was in Miami, even maybe. I don't know, I'm thinking about it, where she was asked about Fred Noonan, about navigation, or about being lost, making sure that Howland was something that they could hit. Could hit. And her response, I'm paraphrasing, was, "I brought the best navigator in the world to make sure that that doesn't happen, that, we hit Howland, that we make it, we finish our flight, and we come home." She believed in him very much. So, yeah, how he met her, how he convinced her, sort of the way they talked and had their conversations, he was her best bet, and she knew it. And she took a gamble, and turns out it didn't work out, So, but yeah, she believed in him 100%. So.
Well, you touched on something briefly that we see in the movie, because the last stop in the movie that we see before Howland Island is in Papua New Guinea. And while they're there, Fred and Amelia grab drinks at a little bar to rest for the evening before taking off the next day. And then, of course, watching the movie, we know what's going to happen. It's like watching the Titanic. You kind of know how, what is going to happen at the end. But as I was watching this scene, I couldn't help but pick up on at least two red flags that seem to suggest that there's a problem imminent. One is that the movie implied Fred had a drinking problem, although he did flat out tell Amelia at one point in the movie that his drinking has never affected his work, which kind of goes back to what you were talking about, being a functional alcoholic. But then secondly, after Amelia and Fred take off from Papua New Guinea, the guy at the airfield, a guy named Mr. Balfour, radios George Putnam to say that the headwinds were stronger than Amelia and Fred thought, so their plane had to use about 9% more fuel than they calculated. And then on top of that, Mr. Balfour tries to hail them on the radio to let them know about this, but he's not successful in doing that. So that tells me that perhaps Amelia and Fred would be surprised by running out of fuel faster than they expected. Is there any truth to these potential problems as they left Papua New Guinea?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. The Tom Detweiler, who was on our show, who was the operations manager for Titanic, and his resume is insane. He told me something that's always stuck with me, and I say it every time I get the chance to say it. And a lot of these accidents, it's never just one thing. It's the sum of a lot of little things that lead up to the end result, what we have, right? One of those, surely, we'll talk about a few of them. One was weight. They were really, really concerned about the aircraft. Amelia has been quoted in papers leading up to that takeoff in particular. They had the takeoff inlay for Howland. She kept saying she was flying at weighted capacity, which is an interesting way to say it. And they were throwing out everything you can imagine, including their raft, including some things that kind of boggles the mind. She left her pistol there. There's a lot of things. They were counting the ounces, essentially, because they knew that Lockheed specs were meant that the plane couldn't weigh more than a certain amount on a paved runway with a certain length to take off. And they weren't on a paved runway. They were on a grass runway. As a matter of fact, there is footage of that last takeoff. You can see it on YouTube of them, actually, people at Lay shooting them taking off, getting up onto the aircraft and taking off. By the way, Fred Noonan does not look drunk, not in the slightest, when they do that. And I will say, and I did mean to say this, I apologize. This is my fault. You did ask earlier, the movie does indicate that they met in Miami. They had flown previously together. So that is inaccurate. Technically, they had met each other, and he had been involved earlier in the flight. They had the whole ground loop incident, had to reverse course. That's kind of a whole nother thing. But again, some of a lot of little things, right? So the headwinds, certainly. The fuel, certainly. That's a big, big, big point of contention when it comes to theory. How much fuel did they actually leave Lay with? Everything you're talking about when it comes to Harry Balfour is 100% accurate. He tried to get in touch with them. He tried to. couldn't receive the Earhart and Noonan couldn't receive his transmissions. They finally did receive his transmissions, and they seemed to sort of, make the adjustments and necessary adjustments needed to combat headwinds and things of that nature. But we don't know what was going on in the aircraft. Essentially, that's kind of the rough part. And yeah, you're right. If they had not anticipated those headwinds, now a lot of people would say that the headwinds were well known in that in that part of the world at that time. And there's about half the people that would say that they weren't discovered. Those headwinds, the headwind shift wasn't discovered until like 5 years after they were in the area. So headwinds would have been a big factor in the end result, and so would have obviously fuel and the lack of fuel, which brings us to sort of the end of the film when they're she's saying all these really well known historically famous lines. Like we must be on you but cannot see you. We're on 157337, flying north and south, all that stuff. And her last word that she ever spoke on record was the word wait, which is an interesting word to choose as your last word.
Obviously, the weight would factor into the fuel, but would it also factor into, speaking of Howland, just being a smaller island and being able to take off as you were saying that it was part of the concern of weight, not as much getting there, but being able to take off from the island again?
Yeah, I think so. Taking off in both cases, from not only from Lay, but trying to anticipate Howland. Howland would have given him a little bit more run, a little bit more room to run, to kind of get up off the ground and take off. And as you said, it was 18 feet off the ground. Lay was certainly not. If you look at them taking off at Lay, a lot of the bystanders, the witnesses, said that it looked like the plane just went right off the cliff. And luckily she was able to pull that stick and it was able to they were doing circles over the water until they were able to get enough, between them and the water to get up off they almost died right there. So Howland would have been a different situation because it's obviously not the same topography. It's not the same, height or anything. But they also had the Itasca there, off the coast of Howland. That's also portrayed in the film. The Itasca was there, and that they were there to do their job, which was to bring them in, help bring them in, help them with R&R, get them, rested up, refueled, and get them off to Hawaii to finish the last leg of the flight. And even with the Itasca there, and the Itasca pulling the signals that they were pulling and all of that stuff, like they talk about at the end of the film, or that they show you at the end of the film. It's one of history's greatest mysteries when it comes to why they couldn't communicate with each other and why they couldn't see each other, and why when Leo Bellart stepped outside the radio room expecting to see her coming right over on top of the Itasca, he didn't see them anywhere. And that was kind of mind-boggling to the radio room operators, as especially when they were pulling consistent signal strengths in, like they were at the end of the film.
Yeah, I want to ask you about some of the details that we see in the movie, because we do see the Itasca, U.S. Coast Guard cutter, anchored at Howland. And then they can hear Amelia's transmissions, but she can't seem to hear the replies. The attempts for Morse code don't work either. According to George Putnam in the movie, they didn't even take the receiver anyway, perhaps because of the weight thing. So it's mostly a one-way conversation. But then to make matters worse, in the movie, someone accidentally left the direction finder on the Itasca on overnight, so the battery is dead. That means they can't pinpoint her plane's location. And then after a few communications from Amelia to Itasca, there is a brief moment where Amelia does seem to hear something back from Itasca, along with Itasca's blowing smoke in an attempt to send a visual signal for their location. And then the final radio transmission to Itasca in the movie says they're on position line 157337, and they're running north-south. Itasca hears this and immediately radios back if she can receive their transmissions, and the radio is silent. Is that really how Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan disappeared?
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
The sum of a lot of little things, right? I mean, it really ended up being just a very unfortunate set of events. Leo Bellart's was flabbergasted by it, and he was, he kept that with him his whole life. He was the last real eyewitness. He was talking. He wasn't making, as you mentioned, two-way radio communication with them, but he was speaking to them, and he could hear her speaking. So they just couldn't hear each other. You're right. And again, to take it all the way back to the ground loop, it wasn't always just Earhart and Noonan. It was actually going to be a larger crew And one of the people on the crew was a man by the name of Harry Manning, who there was also rumor that Earhart had slept with and had an affair with earlier in her career. But he was an expert at Morse code, and he could have given them a lot more options. Noonan could have done the navigations while he took the radios. That's kind of what they did on the flight over from Oakland to Hawaii, which was the first leg of the original flight. This is prior to March 20th of 37, when she ground loops the aircraft in Hawaii, and they have to change directions and rebuild the aircraft and all that jazz. But she, if they had Manning on board, we might not be sitting here having this conversation right now. It might be a very different historical, piece right now. Right now, though, we have really no oil slick, no wreckage, no evidence of anything other than they have the original Itasca call logs. My co-host for Vanish, Jen Taylor, she says this, and I love it. If this is a modern day domestic violence murder case, the Itasca call logs are the final text messages between the couple. Like that's basically kind of what we've got. And then we've got about 88 years, almost 90 years, in a couple years now, of theory. All over the world. That puts them in all kinds of different, situations all over the world. And so, the film the film is largely based off of a book or the work of a gentleman by the name of Elgin Long, who was a pioneering aviator and one of the if there was going to be a Mount Rushmore of Earhart researchers, he would be one of the four for sure. And it was based a lot on his work, and his theory was that they did just run out of gas, and they did just fall short of Howland, and that they are somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, 18,000 ish feet down, and that it will be recovered one day, whether it's by one of these people that are out here searching for it specifically, or whether it's by some like fiber optic cable company that's going to map the underwater ocean and just kind of stumble across the aircraft one day, But it was largely based on Elgin's research, and they posit that she ran out of gas. A lot of people agree with that, and a lot of what we have in that sum of a lot of little things kind of adds up to them running out of gas and just ending up in the water. The question is, you're looking for an aircraft that's got a 55.5-foot wingspan, 39.5-foot long, in an area that's roughly the size of Texas at about $2 million a day. So it's very, very difficult to search an area that big. That's kind of where we are now, 88 years later.
Which is even more, I mean, in the movie, they're talking about how hard it would be to find Howland. And that's an island that's, miles long. I mean, just a couple miles, but that's more than an airplane in the same expanse, right? So that was the whole difficulty. Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think a lot of people, a lot of the theorists, whether you believe in Japanese capture, crash and sink, whether they believe the plane's a buka, whether you believe the plane's never going to be found, it's under a runway in Saipan, or, whatever you subscribe to, everybody kind of tends to agree on that point. They just ran into a lot of bad stuff that day. And, we just don't have an ending to it. So that's kind of what leaves us to this point, or leads us to this point, rather, 88 years later, and all the fallout around their disappearance, I should say, in 1937, July of 1937. So just a few weeks ago, we just had the anniversary. Yeah. So.
Well, the movie does end with the disappearance, but as you mentioned before, Amelia, the 2009 version might be the best one. But let's say that's still like 16 years ago as of this recording. So let's say you're in charge of directing the next biopic about Amelia Earhart's life. What's something you want to make sure got included that we don't get to see in the 2009 movie?
There's a presentation I just attended. I'm biased because it's by a really good friend. Her name is Dr. Margie Arnold, and she does a presentation. We just attended at the Earhart Birthplace Museum during the Earhart Festival, and her presentation concentrates on the 4 years leading up to the moment that she is selected for transatlantic, and Margie gives incredible detail about not only her relationship with Sam Chapman, who I kind of teased about earlier in the conversation, but everything that Amelia was setting herself up to be and do, and maybe an alternate career as a social worker. Margie states, and I tend to believe her, that she really had a chance at being like the next Jane Addams. Like, she really could have been. I think that Earhart was a woman that, She was pre-med at one point at Columbia. She was a nurse's aide in World War I. She was a photographer, a truck driver, obviously an aviator. I mean, she did, all kinds of stuff. And, that's just the kind of woman that we're dealing with, here at the center of all of this. But I would probably I would build that film and concentrate it on those 4 years. I would cast to Sam Chapman. I would do all of that stuff. And I would look into the nitty gritty details of the moment before. And I would end the film on her walking into Putnam's office and being selected for the transatlantic flight. Because everybody kind of knows from 28 on to 37, there's always more room to cover. But that 9-year period is like really covered aggressively. This 4 years, not so much. So I think that would be really fun. Lori's book did a great job of diving into some of that as well. But I think a real hard concentration on that would make a really fun film.
Well, I have a couple of follow-ups on that. One, from everything you learned about Amelia Earhart, how well do you think Hilary Swank did bringing her movie to life? And for your biopic, who would you cast in that role?
I would cast a young Amelia. Her name is Sophia Lillis. I don't know how old she is now. She is 23 now. And I found her. I saw her first in the It films, the remake, the one they did the two, back in 20. I don't know when that was, 2017 or something like that. And she was excellent in those films. And I thought, man, that's an Earhart. Like if you wanted to take a young Earhart, like a younger version of her, and make kind of build to that 28 flight, or take her through her young or her late teenage years and maybe her early 20s, that would be she would be perfect for it. As far as Hilary, I think she did a fantastic job. I also thought Diane Keaton did a really good job in her film. I mean, I think everybody sort of brings something to Earhart specifically. She's got a lot of little nuances and things. I think Earhart got a lot of the ticks down. Hilary Swank got a lot of the ticks down for Earhart. I think she got a lot of her her cadences down, her nuances, some of her facial expressions were pretty on point. Like because there's a lot of video and a lot of pictures of Earhart out there. So it's not somebody that we don't have anything. She's not a ghost. She was, at the time she disappeared, the most photographed person on the face of the earth. So yeah, I think Hilary Swank did a good job. I mean, she's a 2-time Oscar winner. I mean, when I saw that she was being, she was going to do the role, I thought it was a good fit. I've seen the Earhart Birthplace Museum has a bunch of her outfits. As a matter of fact, the one on the poster with the AE, the jumpsuit that she has, which she never really had, but it was a jumpsuit that they put her in for the movie and just for the promo and stuff. That's in the Birthplace Museum, the one that Hilary Swank wore in the film and stuff. And so that's kind of cool. We got to shoot a bunch of our documentary stuff on that backdrop of her suits and her stuff that she wore in the film. So, but I liked it. I thought they did a good job. I thought Richard Gere was great as Putnam. Richard Gere's got that really great. He can be charming, but he could also be, a jerk.
Sounds like George Putnam too, being in PR.
Yeah.
And you got both sides.
Yeah. There's two sides to that for sure.
Yeah.
But I thought she did a great job. Hilary Swank's a fantastic actress. I mean, her catalog is really great, and it's a hard role to play. She's Earhart's a very complex person, and so if I was directing, I would love to bring somebody in like Sophia Lillis and just have her just go to town on it and just do a young version of it. When she was a social worker and when she was doing all that stuff, and because I think she forms a lot of those relationships that end up being valuable to her, 7 to 8 or 9 years later, right up to the point she disappears, that are really formed and built foundationally in those 4 years leading up to the transatlantic flight. So I would focus on that.
Well, the 2009 Amelia movie ends with a disappearance, but I know there have been numerous times where people have claimed to have found Amelia Earhart's plane. So correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I know, it hasn't been found yet, but I know you've been doing years of research for the Chasing Earhart Project. So I have a 2-part question for you as we wrap up our discussion today. First, can you share an overview of the current status of finding Amelia Earhart's plane? And can you tell my audience more about the Chasing Earhart Project and where they can learn more about your work?
Oh, yes, I'd love to. So just a very, very quick, the short version. There are several active investigations all over the world right now going on. I just got off the phone yesterday with our group that's going to be looking at this aircraft out in Buca to try to rule it out and get it out of the way, or maybe rule it in. We'll see. There are deep ocean searches going on. There's a search going on with the Archaeology Channel and Dr. Rick Pettigrew that has made a lot of headlines lately because Purdue got involved in that expedition, and they're going out to Nicomaroro I want to say in November. They're going to go out there and they're going to look at something called the Taraya object, which is an object that was found by brothers Mike and Robert Ashmore several years ago via some satellite imagery in a lagoon on the island of Nicomaroro. Now, the folks at Tiger, a lot of the folks, I won't put words in their mouth, but I'm just basing this off sort of like media and things I've seen and watched and people I've talked to, of course. There's a kind of a divide within, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery there. Part of Tiger, Rick Gillespie and those folks believe that, hey, we've kind of gone over this already. It's not there. But Dr. Pettigrew and his team believe it's certainly warrants being looked at. And Purdue's in tow. That's a big feather in their cap. And they're going out in November. So they're going out in November. We're trying to go out sometime around that time as well for Buca. So hopefully we'll have some good finality and clarification on two major theories at the end of this year. You never know though with Earhart stuff because it's all about money. It's all about funding. It's all about what Earhart was doing back in the day with Purdue, funding and trying to get dollars raised. So there's 3 different actor investigations going on right now. And there's also a lot of work going on for Japanese capture behind the scenes. It's a little bit more of a slow burn, but that is something that's going to be, uncovered in archives and things like that. It's not going to be, you're not going to go out on some island and find an aircraft or anything. If you believe in Japanese capture, you likely believe that the aircraft was destroyed and is buried under a runway in Saipan and is in a billion pieces that will never be found. So if that's the case, then you're never going to find it. You're just going to find some kind of anecdotal or documentation, evidence. So that's being worked on. And then there's always a few other things that are going on when it comes to Earhart. I've got projects coming out regarding some really exciting things I can't talk about publicly yet. Really, I wish I could, but like in a couple months they'll be released. But I would say just watch the Chasing Earhart podcast space, and you'll have all you need there. As far as the show. Just to wrap it up here, we've been going for, 140, 50 episodes-ish right now. And Lori Gwen Shapiro is our most recent episode, just came out a couple of weeks ago. You can catch that on any podcatcher, anywhere you listen to your podcast, or, we're everywhere pretty much. And the podcast aims to just sort of give a platform to everybody that's in the Earhart case, whether they're on the disappearance side or the legacy side, whether they're an author or a scientist or a historian or whatever it is. I don't care. I want to hear from all of them. And we've talked to pretty much everybody who's anybody. There's a few notables that we haven't talked to for specific reasons. But we will keep going. It's something, I rebranded this thing like 30 episodes or 40 episodes ago, and I was only ever going to do 3 or 4 episodes, back. And we just people kept coming forward and new stuff kept breaking, as it tends to do in this case. And I think that's what we'll have until the case is ultimately resolved satisfactorily. That's the big key question. Is it going to be satisfactory to everybody who has an idea about what may have happened to Earhart and Noonan on July 2nd? So that's what the podcast is all about. I've also got a book out called Rabbit Hole, The Vanishing of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, which was basically season 1 of our podcast, Vanished. It's unlike any book you've ever read on the case. I can guarantee you that. The format's different. We've got over 60 collaborators all over the Earhart case in that book and in that podcast. It's the largest collective effort ever on the disappearance of Earhart and Noonan. And that's in bookstores right now, and it's on Amazon and then Barnes & Noble and all that stuff. So you can pick that up or listen to the podcast, or you can go check out Chasing Earhart.
Fantastic. Yeah. I'll make sure to add all those links in the show notes for anybody who's watching. Thanks again so much for your time, Chris.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. Thank you once again to Chris Williamson for helping us separate fact from fiction in 2009's Amelia. If you want to dig deeper into the true story and start to unravel more of the mystery behind Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan's disappearance, check out Chris's work with the Chasing Earhart Project, including a fantastic podcast of the same name that you'll find links to in the show notes for this episode, as well as on the show's home on the web over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/373. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1, Amelia Earhart's final communication came just after they took off from Highland Island. Number 2, Amelia's celebrity served as a powerful means for her to champion other women in STEM and aviation. Number 3, Amelia was a nurse's aide during World War I. Did you figure out which one is a lie? I've got the answer in the envelope right here, so let's open this up and find out. And the lie is number 1. As we learned, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were trying to find Howland Island when they disappeared. They weren't taking off from it. And as Chris pointed out, one of the major challenges to finding her plane is simply the size of the search area. He mentioned the plane having a 55.5-foot wingspan, and the search area is about the size of Texas, with the cost of about $2 million a day. So you start to get a sense for just why the plane hasn't been found yet. But hopefully, one day, that will change. Before I let you go for today, I have an exciting announcement of my own to share with you. I have a new class available right now called Getting Started with Video Podcasting, and it's all aimed at helping you add high-quality video to your own podcast. As you may or may not know, before I started podcasting for the first time over 10 years ago, I spent a decade or so before that in my career doing video production and helping teach the artists at feature film companies like Pixar, DreamWorks, Universal, and so on. The good news is that you can take proven standards from the movies and use them with whatever equipment you already have to get some great results without having to buy anything new. So that's what my class is all about. I'll share the behind the scenes of my own video setup, as well as how you can get the most out of whatever camera and microphone you already have. Or if you are in the market for a new one, there are some recommendations in there as well. Learn more about that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/video. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/video. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Chris and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.